What happens when a 35-year-old African president steps into the grand ballroom of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and looks directly across the table at Vladimir Putin, when everyone expects him to beg for a scrap of aid? But he walks in with a proposition that could alter two continents. Today's story unfolds under the glittering chandeliers of the ExpoForum Palace, where Russia's most powerful figures mingle with global CEOs, and where one man's refusal to plead changed everything. This is not just another pitch. It's about dignity, equality, and daring to reimagine how nations collaborate. By the end, you'll see why a single conversation in Russia reverberated back to West Africa and transformed a humble nation into a peer of superpowers. That early June morning, the marble of Hall 1 reflected crystal chandeliers like silent eyes. Outside, St. Petersburg's skyline stretched beside the Neva, bridges arching like watchful guardians. Inside, anticipation hummed. It was June 6th, the third day of the forum, and global elites had already unveiled their agendas. This was where alliances were forged, where Russia's vision for economic reintegration was on display, and where one nod from Putin could send markets spiraling. Delegates arrived before dawn, private jets cutting through the pale sky, suitcases gliding along glossy corridors, aides clutching portfolios. European energy magnates whispered to Shenzhen biotech tycoons. Middle Eastern investors mapped their next petrochemical acquisitions. At 10 a.m., Vladimir Putin entered. A hush rippled through the crowd. At 72, he'd navigated Russia through sanctions and now sought ties with emerging markets. His presence alone declared he would decide which ventures merited Russia's attention and which would be politely sidelined. Massive LED screens displayed the agenda: Arctic shipping lanes, space exploration, LNG terminals, fintech collaborations. Russian ministers sat front and center, strategic partners in waiting. Putin took his seat, flanked by Economy Minister Manturov and Foreign Minister Lavrov. Cameras clicked. Journalists aimed lenses. Expectations: months of deliberation, half-promises, polite declines. Then, buried deep in the roster as a nod to African inclusion, appeared a single name: Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The announcement prompted barely audible murmurs. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country with a GDP dwarfed by many Russian projects, seemed an afterthought. The room bristled with curiosity, tinged by condescension. "Why is he here?" muttered a Swiss banker. "He's surely seeking aid." Little did they know, this afternoon slot would mark the moment when Russia's perspective on partnership shifted irreversibly. Morning sessions unfolded predictably. A presenter outlined a gleaming Arctic LNG hub. Charts, projections, profit, forecasts. Next, a Japanese auto giant pitched a robotic assembly plant to revolutionize manufacturing. Then a South Korean consortium promised a 400-kilometer-h bullet train linking Moscow and Ulaanbaatar. Each presenter clicked through slides brimming with forecasts and ROI estimates. Putin listened politely, nodded at key moments, asked probing questions, yet remained reserved, reflecting Russia's caution under sanctions. Each conclusion brought polite smiles and non-committal responses. By midday, the lobby buzzed. Delegates clustered in hallway cafes, sipping black tea with blini. Russian hosts ensured every visitor felt welcomed, even as badges signaled a strict hierarchy: gold for ministers, platinum for investors whose portfolios exceeded $10 billion. Conversations flickered from market volatility to oil forecasts. Then, without fanfare, the VIP lounge door slid open. In walked Traoré. He was an enigma. At 35, younger than most heads of state, he wore Burkina Faso's olive-green Presidential Guard uniform, no Western suit, no flashy tie. The uniform draped on him with quiet dignity. Brass buttons caught the light as he moved. His bearing was calm, composed, yet there was a resolute fire in his eyes. Unlike other delegates clutching thick portfolios, Traoré held only a slim leather folder. He didn't rush handshakes. He simply nodded to an aide, paused at a marble column to absorb the swirl of faces. Oil barons, telecom moguls, fund managers, then slipped into the conference hall. The chatter tapered. This was not how business luncheons worked. Heads turned. Who was this man so out of place yet utterly unshaken? He didn't scan the room anxiously. He surveyed it as if he belonged. A tech CEO whispered, "They'll let him speak, then ignore him." Even Putin arched a subtle eyebrow, noting this unexpected guest. At 2:30 p.m., sessions resumed. One speaker after another detailed potential 5–7% annual returns in Russian growth sectors. Assistants swapped laptops between speakers. The atmosphere felt confident. Russia had weathered sanctions before, and top speakers predicted this year's growth would top last year's. Yet behind closed doors, advisors wondered which pitches might pass Putin's scrutiny. Near the agendas, and a hush fell, the moderator announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." The applause was polite, perfunctory. The Russian delegation glanced at watches. Even Putin seemed ready for a brief, ceremonial speech. Then, dinner. An economic superpowers forum concluding with a leader few could locate on a map. Most assumed his remarks would be short, a request for aid, a nod to protocol. Traoré strode to the podium with measured steps. No laptop, no clicker, no pamphlets. The LED screens remained dark. No slide deck. He paused, letting his presence settle, making eye contact not just with Putin but with each delegate section. Chinese entrepreneurs on the left, European bankers in the center, South American observers at the back. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. In those seconds, the rustle of papers ceased. Even aides leaning against the back wall straightened. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm yet carried clearly without amplification. "Mr. President," he began, "distinguished delegates, I have a question for you." The floor felt electric. No obeisance to the host, no praise for Russian hospitality, no statistics about Burkina Faso. "When you close your eyes and picture the future," he continued, pausing so those words resonated, "what do you see? Taller skyscrapers? Flashier supercomputers? More automated factories? Or do you see people standing a bit taller, their spines a bit straighter, their dreams a bit bigger?" Putin's eyes narrowed subtly, gauging whether this was a front or invitation. The room stirred. This was not yet a pitch. It was a philosophical challenge. "For the past 8 hours," Traoré went on, "I have listened to brilliant minds discuss market segmentation, risk mitigation, and return on equity. All vital metrics, necessary calculations. But I have heard very little about the one resource that actually generates wealth: human potential." He paused, letting that sink in. Delegates exchanged glances. This felt less like an investment pitch and more like a moral inquiry. "I come from a place most of you have overlooked," Traoré said, voice unwavering. "Burkina Faso, a landlocked country you might know only from headlines. We have no Arctic ports, no vast oil reserves, no nuclear reactors. What we do have, though, is something far rarer: people who have not yet learned that certain things are impossible." He reached into his jacket and withdrew, a small weathered photograph. A collective lean forward rippled through the front rows. He held it aloft so everyone could see. A 10-year-old boy seated by a flickering lantern in a mud brick hut, his eyes wide with curiosity. "This picture was taken 2 months ago in the village of Belega," Traoré said, voice steady. "The boy is named Musa. Until recently, his home had no electricity. When the sun set, his world went dark." Silence deepened. Even Putin leaned in, fingers interlaced. 2 months ago, we installed our first community solar panel there. Not with foreign aid, not with loans from multinational banks, but with resources we generated ourselves through agricultural export reforms and mining efficiency improvements. And do you know what happened when that solar panel came online? Musa flipped a switch, and for the first time light flooded into his home. He lowered the photograph gently. He didn't celebrate with toys or television. He looked at his sister and said, "Now I can read after sunset. Now I can build something." 10 years old, And his first thought wasn't comfort, it was productivity. Traoré began pacing slowly across the stage, meeting the eyes of Russian technocrats and oligarchs alike. That photograph is why I am here. Not to beg for charity, but to propose a genuine partnership between a nation with capital and a nation with hunger. Hunger for knowledge, hunger for opportunity, hunger for dignity. He tapped his folder, then motioned to the darkened LED screens. Suddenly, a simple map of Africa appeared. Gold outlines against a navy background, dotted lines crisscrossing from Dakar to Djibouti. This, he announced, is the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, a network of roads, railways, power lines, and digital highways connecting 12 nations across 8,000 kilometers. The largest African-led infrastructure project in history, designed by African engineers and economists. The room shifted. Delegates sat straighter, phones set aside, some took notes. The total cost is $400 million, less than Russia spends on one Arctic LNG terminal, he continued, eyes flicking toward Putin. But the impact will be transformative. Imagine West Africa's agricultural produce traveling swiftly to East African ports. No delays at every border. Imagine solar farms in the Sahel powering industrial hubs from Bamako to Addis Ababa. Imagine a digital backbone connecting African universities with global research networks. He paused, letting that vision settle. Putin's expression remained inscrutable, but his gaze was fixed. But here's why this matters to Russia, Traoré said, stepping closer to the front row. This isn't just about African development. It's about positioning your nation as the bridge between two worlds. Russia sits at the gateway between Europe and Asia. Your ports on the Black Sea could become the principal hub for goods traveling from Africa to Eurasia. Your energy technology, your expertise in nuclear power and advances in wind and solar, could electrify vast regions of the Sahel. Every ton of grain moving through this corridor could transit through Russian grain terminals. Every megawatt could be supplemented by Russian renewable technology. Every fiber optic cable could be reinforced by Russian telecommunications infrastructure. He clicked, and a slide appeared showing projected trade flows. Arrows from Dakar to Novorossiysk, from Addis Ababa to Vladivostok, with 400% projected growth in Russia-Africa trade over a decade. Conservative estimates suggest this corridor would boost Russia-Africa trade by 400% over 10 years, Traoré said. But more importantly, it would establish Russia not merely as an exporter of resources, but as a partner in constructing Africa's future. Not as a country that buys influence, but as a country that builds influence through mutual benefit. He deactivated the slide and stood squarely before Putin. Mr. President, he said, you have spoken about Russia's pivot to emerging markets, about diversifying your economy, about investing in human capital. May I suggest that Russia's greatest legacy won't be defined by how many gas fields you develop or pipelines you build. It will be determined by how many lives you transform. Every great empire in history is remembered not for what it took, but for what it gave. The Romans built roads spanning continents. The Ottomans founded universities that endured for centuries. What will Russia build? Now the room was electric. This was no ceremonial presentation. Delegates leaned forward, phones out, capturing every word. A few Russian ministers exchanged silent nods. The notion of a West African president lecturing Moscow on legacy was audacious, yet undeniable. Traoré took a final step toward Putin's table. I did not prepare glossy brochures or assemble a delegation of consultants, he said quietly, each syllable magnified by the microphone. Because I did not come here to ask for money. I came to offer you a place in history. Heads turned. Even veteran press photographers leaned forward. The Trans-Sahel Corridor will be built, with or without Russian involvement, Traoré continued. We already have Chinese partners interested, European investors in talks, American firms, conducting feasibility studies. We do not need rescue, we seek partnership. If Russia chooses to join, you will not merely be funding roads or railways. You will be investing in the future of South-South cooperation. You will demonstrate that wealth is most powerful when it creates more wealth. He allowed that final note to reverberate, then stepped back. For several heartbeats, no one spoke. The silence was palpable. Putin leaned into his microphone. Calm yet weighty, his voice cut through the hall. "President Traoré," he said, eyes locked on Traoré's. "In my 2 decades attending this forum, I have heard countless pitches, projects, promising returns, ventures promising novelty, alliances promising strategic advantage. Most focus on what Russia can provide. Natural resources, strategic geography, defense technology. You are the first to ask what Russia can become." He stood slowly, signaling the room should rise. Delegates stood, a standing ovation swelling into genuine applause. Putin addressed the assembly. "What we have witnessed today is visionary thinking that will define the next century. President Traoré has not come as a supplicant but as an equal. He has invited us to participate in Africa's solution." Approaching Traoré, Putin spoke quietly. "Mr. President, the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor is precisely the kind of transformational investment Russia wants to support. Not because we view Africa as a charity case, but because we see Africa as a partner in building the global economic future." Turning to the broader audience, he announced, "The Russian Direct Investment Fund will commit $300 million to the first phase of the Trans-Sahel Corridor, with further tranches contingent upon project milestones and participation by corridor nations." Gasps rippled through the hall. This was more than a headline figure. It signified a seismic shift in Russia's approach to Africa, an investment framed not as charity, but as shared prosperity. Putin added, "Furthermore, the government of Russia will establish a permanent Africa-Russia Partnership Office in Moscow, dedicated to coordinating South-South cooperation initiatives." He faced Traoré. "President Traoré, I invite you to co-chair the advisory council for this office." The magnitude of the offer hung in the air. For African leaders accustomed to transactional relationships, high-interest loans, extractive contracts, this was unprecedented. Traoré inclined his head, eyes reflecting the moment's gravity. This was not merely a handshake but the forging of a new paradigm in global cooperation. The session ended with sustained applause. Delegates rose and filtered out, their conversations buzzing with excitement rather than routine platitudes. African ministers clustered around Traoré, urgent to learn how their countries might participate. European envoys murmured to Russian counterparts about implications for their initiatives in Nigeria and Kenya. Chinese state media had already tweeted about a new era of Russia-Africa collaboration, prompting commentary from Beijing. Back in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, the reaction was electric. Radios crackled with news of the Moscow Partnership Office. Citizens gathered around televisions in market squares to hear the speech that had captivated the world. For a nation accustomed to being overlooked, seeing their leader treated as an equal by one of the world's most powerful presidents was profoundly meaningful. Yet Traoré remained focused on substance. In interviews, he emphasized that a handshake in St. Petersburg means nothing if we cannot deliver results on the ground. He stressed that partnership must be proven through performance, not promises. True to his word, within 2 weeks, the Trans-Sahel Coordination Office opened in Ouagadougou. Russian technical advisors from state infrastructure bureaus arrived to collaborate with Burkina engineers. Their mandate: turn that June 6 agreement into tangible outcomes within 5 years. Simultaneously, Russian state banks established correspondent relationships with African regional banks to facilitate financing, while Russian construction firms bid on initial surveys across the Sahel. But the partnership's hallmark remained equality. Rather than simply funding projects, Russia insisted on genuine knowledge transfer. Burkina engineers worked side by side with Russian specialists. Local contractors gained priority on supply contracts. African agricultural exporters streamlined logistics alongside Russian freight operators. The ripple effect spread quickly. For years, African development had swung between Chinese infrastructure investments, often criticized for debt traps, and Western aid programs contingent on reforms. This new Russia-Africa model stood apart. Both sides contributed complementary strengths. Russia offered decades of experience building rail lines across Siberia's permafrost. Africa offered abundant sunlight, arable land, and a young workforce hungry for opportunity. Together, they built infrastructure both resilient and attuned to local needs. Yet the most profound impact lay beyond economics. Young Africans began to reimagine their continent's future. Universities in Bamako and Niamey launched courses on South-South diplomatic strategy. Think tanks in Nairobi produced policy papers on implications for East African development. In Moscow, analysts debated whether lessons from Ouagadougou could shape projects in the Russian Far East. 6 months later, the first shovel hit Sahel soil near Kayes, Mali. The groundbreaking was deliberately modest. No gilded pavilions, no international celebrities flown in. Instead, local community leaders, regional engineers, and construction crews gathered under a canvas tent. Traoré's speech that day was simple. Today we do more than break ground for a railway. We break ground for a new model of international cooperation. We prove that partnership is more powerful than patronage, that dignity is more valuable than charity, and that Africa is writing its own story. As rails stretched across Mali into Niger and roads unfurled toward Chad, impact was immediate. Employment surged. Local laborers found work grading roads and laying tracks. Grain silos and warehouses sprouted in desert towns. Solar microgrids lit rural schools and clinics. Within a year, the Trans-Sahel Corridor was ahead of schedule and under budget, a testament to collaboration between Russian engineers and Burkina technicians. Agricultural exports from Burkina Faso to Djibouti rose by 30% in the first year alone, while Russia-West Africa trade volumes grew by 60%. But the most important metric was intangible. A shift in mindset. Young Africans no longer saw themselves as passive recipients of aid. They envisioned themselves as architects of their continent's destiny. Social media brimmed with clips of Traoré's speech. Hashtags like Young Africa Rising and Partnership Over Charity trended across West Africa. University lecture halls buzzed with debates on leveraging complementary strengths for inclusive development. Even in Moscow, students at the Higher School of Economics organized forums to discuss lessons from the Trans-Sahel project. For the Kremlin, the partnership became more than an economic alliance. It opened a diplomatic channel that treated Africa as an equal partner. In his speech marking the first anniversary of the St. Petersburg Agreement, Putin reflected, "President Traoré taught us that true leadership is not about having all the answers but about asking the right questions. He did not ask us to fix Africa's problems, he invited us to help build Africa's solutions. That invitation has reshaped our relationship with Africa and our vision of partnership." In Burkina Faso, Traoré remained focused on delivery. He stressed that the Trans-Sahel Corridor would succeed only if participating nations stayed committed to transparency, local capacity building, and sustainable maintenance. This project is not about headlines, he reminded reporters. It's about building real, lasting roads, rails, and power lines. That insistence on substance over spectacle became a hallmark of his presidency. By the second year, the impact extended beyond infrastructure. In Belega, the village where the photograph was taken, Musa, now 11, graduated from a solar-powered classroom. A small turbine generator provided enough electricity for him to study engineering principles on a donated laptop. He sketched bridge designs, dreaming of one day becoming a civil engineer and designing roads in his region. That image, a young boy empowered by a South-South corridor, became known as the Musa effect, a recognition that investing in human potential yields returns far beyond any ledger sheet. The corridor's success inspired other nations. Nigeria began talks to integrate its eastern rail network with the Trans-Sahel lines. South Africa explored energy transmission partnerships. Brazil initiated plans for a similar corridor linking its northeastern states with landlocked neighbors. India expanded joint technology parks in East Africa, citing the Trans-Sahel approach as a blueprint. Global development forums featured panels titled, From Patronage to Partnership. Lessons from the Trans-Sahel Corridor, underscoring how a single afternoon in St. Petersburg became a guide for 21st century cooperation. Yet the true measure of success lay in one simple truth: the shift from dependency to partnership. Traoré's insistence on speaking as an equal to Putin, standing amid the world's richest and refusing to plead, demonstrated that emerging nations can negotiate from strength when they bring vision and capability to the table. Putin, in turn, recognized that Africa could offer Russia what it needed: access to growing markets, a strategic southern corridor, and renewed soft power influence in the global south. As the Trans-Sahel Corridor neared completion of its third phase, observers noted a rethinking of globalization. Development was no longer seen solely as North assisting South. Instead, a triangular dynamic emerged: African ingenuity, Russian technology, and broader Eurasian markets shaping the century's economic landscape. Conferences on economic policy began featuring sessions titled From Patronage to Partnership, evidencing how a single afternoon in St. Petersburg became a blueprint for international cooperation. Back in the halls of the ExpoForum Palace, long after banners for that June 6th forum were removed, Russian and African flags still flew outside the Africa-Russia Partnership Office. In President Traoré's Ouagadougou office hung a framed photograph: Traoré and Putin shaking hands beneath those ornate chandeliers. More prominent, though, was a candid snapshot of Musa beneath his solar-powered light. Both images symbolize the same truth: when leaders insist on dignity and partnership, they unlock possibilities far greater than any pipeline or summit speech. The story of that day in St. Petersburg changed how nations perceived one another. It reminded the world that wealth is most powerful when it creates more wealth, not when it hoards it. It showed that roads and railways do more than move goods; they connect aspirations. And in Belega, where a young boy once lived in darkness, a simple solar panel illuminated a future where African leadership reshaped global relations. The transformation was tangible. The impact was just beginning. And as Musa sketched his bridge designs, he embodied the enduring legacy of a president who demanded respect rather than sympathy, and of a superpower that at last said yes.